In this episode, we bring together two ideas that matter a great deal in the Certified Information Systems Auditor (CISA) journey and in real organizations, even though beginners often do not notice them until something goes wrong. Data classification is the practical process of deciding what kind of information the organization has, how sensitive it is, how important it is, and what level of care it deserves. Compliance enters the picture because many rules, obligations, and internal expectations depend on the enterprise handling different kinds of data in different ways. If a company cannot tell ordinary information from sensitive information, it will struggle to protect the right things, limit access correctly, retain records appropriately, and respond well when auditors or regulators ask questions. That is why this topic sits so naturally inside the management of information technology, IT. Classification is not just a tagging exercise. It is one of the simplest ways management turns judgment about data into repeatable behavior across systems, documents, teams, and business processes. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to start is with the basic meaning of data classification in plain language. Classification means assigning data to categories based on factors such as sensitivity, business value, legal obligation, privacy impact, or operational importance, so the organization can apply the right rules to the right information. Without classification, every file, database record, report, and message tends to be treated inconsistently. Some employees may assume all information is equally sensitive and make work slow and frustrating, while others may assume almost nothing is sensitive and expose the enterprise to unnecessary risk. A sound classification approach helps the organization avoid both extremes by creating a shared way to think about information before questions arise about access, storage, sharing, retention, and disposal. Auditors care about this because classification is often the starting point for many other controls. If the organization cannot explain what kind of data it has, it becomes much harder to defend how that data is protected, who can see it, and why certain compliance decisions were made. One of the biggest beginner misunderstandings is thinking that classification exists mainly for security teams or for labeling files with official-looking stamps that no one truly pays attention to. In reality, classification is valuable because it helps ordinary employees make better day-to-day decisions. A customer service representative may need to know whether a report can be emailed broadly or whether it contains information that should stay within a limited group. A manager may need to know whether a shared folder contains routine planning material or records that require stricter access. A system designer may need to know whether a new data field creates privacy obligations that affect retention, notice, or vendor sharing. In each case, classification supports practical judgment. It helps people avoid guessing. From a CISA perspective, this is important because strong controls are usually the result of clear expectations built into normal work rather than heroic correction after a mistake has already spread through the environment. Most organizations use a small number of classification levels, even though the names may differ. One enterprise may use labels such as public, internal, confidential, and restricted, while another may prefer language tied to its own industry or culture. The exact terms matter less than the logic behind them. The categories should reflect meaningful differences in how information must be handled, not just administrative preference or the desire to sound formal. Public information may be suitable for open release. Internal information may be meant for ordinary business use within the enterprise. Confidential information may require tighter access and sharing limits, and the most restricted category may apply to especially sensitive records where exposure could create serious legal, financial, operational, or reputational harm. What matters for the learner is that classification should support action. If the labels do not change how information is stored, transmitted, accessed, or retained, the scheme may look organized but fail to deliver real control value. Mature organizations choose categories that people can understand and apply consistently in real work. The best classification decisions are based on business impact and context rather than on habit alone. Some information is sensitive because it identifies people, some because it reveals business strategy, some because it affects financial reporting, and some because it supports critical operations that could be disrupted or manipulated. A simple spreadsheet, for example, may look harmless at first glance, but if it contains payroll details, customer account data, unreleased financial results, or merger planning notes, its impact is very different from that of a routine team calendar. This is why classification cannot depend only on format. A document is not confidential merely because it is a spreadsheet, and it is not harmless merely because it is an email. Good classification asks what the information is, how it is used, who could be harmed by misuse, and what obligations attach to it. Auditors appreciate this context because weak programs often rely on superficial rules that miss the real meaning and risk of the data underneath. Before an organization can classify data well, it needs some visibility into what data it actually has and where that data lives. That sounds obvious, but in practice, many enterprises hold more information in more places than leadership realizes. Data may sit in business applications, cloud services, shared drives, reports, collaboration platforms, archived media, vendor systems, employee laptops, and personal work files. If management does not understand those locations and flows, classification becomes inconsistent very quickly. One team may apply careful labels in a central system, while the same information is copied into unmanaged spreadsheets and circulated with no protection at all. That is why data inventories, mapping efforts, and clear ownership support classification so strongly. They help the enterprise identify important data sets, understand how information moves, and decide where classification controls should begin. From an audit standpoint, this matters because a beautiful classification policy has limited value if the organization has only a partial view of the places where sensitive information is stored, reused, and shared. In practical terms, one of the strongest techniques is to classify information as early as possible in its life cycle. When data is created, collected, or entered into a process, the organization has a natural chance to ask what kind of data it is and what rules should follow it from that point forward. A new form can be designed so that certain fields automatically signal a higher classification based on the nature of the information being collected. Templates for business documents can include default classification guidance, so employees are not starting from zero each time they create a file. Systems can require users to choose a classification before saving or distributing certain records, which adds just enough friction to encourage thoughtful handling. The key lesson for a beginner is that early classification is usually stronger than retrospective cleanup. Once copies spread through email, reports, and shared folders, correcting classification becomes harder. Strong management therefore looks for the moment closest to data creation or collection and builds practical classification choices there. Another very practical consideration is the difference between structured data and unstructured data. Structured data is the kind that sits in organized fields and tables, such as customer accounts, transaction records, or employee files stored in business systems. Unstructured data includes documents, slide decks, chat messages, notes, images, and emails, which often contain sensitive information mixed with ordinary conversation or planning content. Many organizations find unstructured data harder to classify because people create it constantly and often outside formal system design. A database field can be governed centrally, but a document prepared for a leadership meeting may be saved in several places, attached to multiple emails, and copied into a presentation without anyone pausing to think about classification. That is why practical classification techniques must address both environments. Employees need simple and understandable ways to identify sensitivity in ordinary work products, not just in central business applications. Auditors often find that classification looks stronger in structured systems than in everyday documents and communications, which can reveal important gaps in the overall program. A classification label only becomes meaningful when it leads to handling rules that people and systems actually follow. If information is classified as highly sensitive, that should influence who may access it, whether it can be printed, how it may be shared, whether encryption is required, how long it should be retained, and what kind of disposal process applies when it is no longer needed. Otherwise, the label becomes decorative rather than operational. This is why mature organizations connect classification to clear rules and not just to awareness messages. Employees should understand that different classes of data come with different expectations for storage, transmission, discussion, and retention. Technical controls often help reinforce those expectations by limiting access, preventing casual forwarding, or flagging unusual sharing behavior. Auditors examine this relationship carefully because an effective classification program should create a visible chain from label to handling requirement to actual behavior. If that chain is broken, the enterprise may believe it is governing data responsibly while real control remains weak. Two common problems in classification programs are overclassification and underclassification, and both create trouble in different ways. Overclassification happens when organizations or employees label too much information as highly sensitive, often out of caution, convenience, or confusion. That can slow work, create unnecessary restrictions, reduce trust in the program, and cause staff to ignore labels because everything appears to carry the same warning. Underclassification is the opposite problem, where sensitive information is treated too casually, often because employees do not recognize its importance or because the program is too vague to guide them properly. That can lead to improper sharing, retention errors, weak access control, or noncompliance with legal or contractual obligations. A practical classification program tries to reduce both problems by using clear categories, relatable examples, ongoing review, and simple decision support for employees. From a CISA point of view, this matters because the strongest control is usually not the most restrictive one. It is the one that matches the real nature of the data closely enough to be applied consistently. Compliance gives data classification even more weight because many obligations apply only when certain categories of information are involved. Personal information, health information, payment-related records, legal documents, employment records, and confidential business data may each carry different expectations under laws, regulations, contracts, or internal policy. If an organization does not classify those data types properly, it may fail to apply the correct retention period, access restrictions, notice requirements, monitoring expectations, or third-party handling rules. This is one reason classification is so often tied to privacy and records management as well as security. Compliance is not achieved just by having a policy that says sensitive data will be protected. The enterprise has to know which data is sensitive in the first place and where that data appears in practice. Auditors often trace control weaknesses back to classification failures because once information is mislabeled or never labeled at all, many downstream compliance decisions become unreliable. Good classification is therefore one of the most practical bridges between broad obligations and day-to-day operational control. Ownership and training are essential because employees cannot classify information well if they do not know what the categories mean or when the decision matters most. Data owners, stewards, managers, and operational teams all play roles in making the program work. Owners help define the meaning and sensitivity of key data sets, while employees need enough instruction to recognize examples in their own workflows. The best training is usually specific enough to feel real rather than abstract. People learn better when they can see how classification affects the reports they send, the folders they manage, the vendor requests they approve, and the customer information they handle. Governance also needs a way to review unusual cases and approve exceptions when information does not fit neatly into one category. Without that support, staff may either guess poorly or avoid classifying difficult cases altogether. Auditors look for evidence that training is connected to actual roles and that the organization can explain how classification decisions are made, reviewed, and corrected over time. Technology can strengthen a classification program, but it should support human judgment rather than replace it blindly. Automated tools may identify patterns that suggest certain files contain sensitive information, apply labels based on predefined rules, or restrict sharing when certain content appears. Those capabilities can be extremely helpful, especially in large environments with too much data for purely manual oversight. At the same time, automation is only as strong as the assumptions built into it. A tool may detect account numbers while yet miss business strategy notes, contract terms, or context that makes a document especially sensitive even without obvious markers. That is why management still needs clear policy, ownership, review, and a way for employees to understand the program beyond what a system applies automatically. For the CISA learner, this is another useful reminder that good control usually combines people, process, and technology. Classification works best when tools reinforce sound governance rather than pretending governance is no longer needed. When auditors evaluate classification, they usually look past the existence of labels and ask whether the program is producing consistent and defensible outcomes. They want to know whether categories are defined clearly, whether important data sets are classified appropriately, whether handling rules align with the assigned class, whether employees understand their responsibilities, and whether compliance obligations are reflected in actual practice. They may examine samples of documents, reports, database extracts, and user behavior to see whether the organization's classification rules are being followed in real work. They may also compare policy language with operational evidence, because a strong policy means little if highly sensitive information is still being shared casually or retained beyond approved limits. One of the most valuable audit insights often comes from noticing where classification breaks down at handoff points, such as exports, email attachments, collaboration tools, or vendor transfers. Those are the places where theory often meets daily reality, and where weak classification design or weak discipline becomes most visible. The larger lesson should feel practical and clear. Data classification is the disciplined process of deciding what kind of information the organization holds and then using that decision to guide access, storage, transmission, retention, disposal, and compliance behavior in a consistent way. The most effective programs classify data early, connect labels to handling rules, support both structured and unstructured information, train employees with real-world examples, and use technology to reinforce rather than replace good judgment. Compliance depends heavily on this discipline because many obligations become meaningful only when the enterprise can identify the types of data those obligations cover. When classification is weak, the organization struggles to prove that it handles information responsibly. When classification is strong, it becomes one of the simplest and most powerful ways to translate policy, privacy, and regulatory expectations into everyday action. For the CISA learner, that is the key takeaway and the reason this topic matters so much in both exams and real-world management.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.